Welcome to everyone across the planet to Connecting the Dots, a laser-fired, quick-fire interview on food and agriculture with international experts, where we seek answers to questions all of us should be asking. I'm Ajay Jakar, Chairman Bharat Krishik Samaj of Farmers Forum India, as well as the Vice Chair of Action Track 2 Shift to Sustainable Consumption Patterns at the UN Food Systems Summit. I'm delighted to introduce Maximo Torero Cullen, the Chief Economist at the FAO, with wide experience at the World Bank and at International Food Policy Research Institute. Thank you, Maximo, for taking time out to join us today.
No, a pleasure.
Thank you. We will dive straight in. And the first question is that the pandemic year has shown greater consolidation of power and money in big agriculture, big food, and big retail. That is agriculture input companies, aggregators, packaged food companies, and e-commerce or retailers. Is FAO studying this phenomena? Do you find this consolidation worrisome, and what can the world do about it?
So it's not clear to us that there has been a greater consolidation. I think what is clear to us is that COVID-19 has shown how resilient the agricultural system is. And what that means is that companies figure out ways in which they can cope with the crisis and with the lockdowns, like, for example, increasing their economies of scope. Instead of producing 7 different types of commodities, they produce 3, so they can reduce the different amount of inputs they need to produce. Now, for sure, in any period of recession or a slowdown, which is what we are living because of COVID-19, some companies will close, and that could imply certain type of consolidation, but that doesn't mean that in the future the entry could come back as we recover. So for us, it's important to look at these things. For us, it's very important. We were already looking at the market structure of the agribusiness sector so that we can understand if there were problems of competition and issues that we need to look carefully, because that will have a correlate on prices of commodities. No? And as you know, 3 billion people don't have access to healthy diets today. And we need to figure out and to understand why is the case. It's an issue of lack of supply. It's an issue of too much demand. It's an issue of market structure and monopolistic competition, for example, because few players that differentiate the products. So those are topics which are really important to understand, and COVID-19 is a good way to look at them too because of the shock.
You have written that data, technology, and innovation can help build resilience and manage risks in agriculture. You have also stated that digital technologies lower information asymmetries, transaction costs, and add to improving traceability and efficiencies. All are correct. These can be positive, but only if governments have strong antitrust laws, legal and regulatory framework. On such matters, the record of most governments has been disappointing, leading to increased concentration and exclusion, crowding out small and medium enterprises. Is this inevitable, or can this be avoided to increase competition and inclusion?
Yeah, so normally the way we are pursuing our work is 4 accelerators, no? Data, new data, innovation, technology, and what we call complements, okay? And the complements have 3 elements: institutions, governance, and human capital. So what we are arguing is, if I'm going to push for digital technologies in a country, innovation and technology too, I need to have the institutionality to avoid a problem of market power, no? And that means you want to avoid one big player to control everything. And you are right. When you assess how the regulatory agencies being put in countries to assure competition have operated in the past. In Latin America, there is a lot of experience because of the privatization, especially of telecommunications. You see that what happens is that most of the regulatory agencies get captured by the private sector. Why? Because they can offer better salaries to the regulators, and therefore they will move, and then your regulating agency will start to weaken. Latin America is a great example for that. Now, what we can do to avoid that? I think one way to avoid that is to do something similar to what the European Union does. So you have a regulator for the whole sub-region. So if you go to Africa, for example, we can think of a stronger regulator for West Africa, for East Africa, for the different sub-regions of Africa. That could create a neat economies of scale that will assure you that you don't have this problem of capture. That's one solution. The other solution is to assure and to put some measures in place that will assure entry without a barrier at the beginning. And that is linked to interconnection, interoperability. And those are laws that you can put in place from the beginning and don't require too much of a monitoring. No? So there are core elements that you can set up that the incumbent in telecommunications have to assure that there is interconnectivity so that if any other entry agency comes in, any other company, they can easily interconnect into the core network. So we need to find innovative ways. But for me, the most important is that we need to scale up and get the economies of scale at the regional level, sub-regional level, to assure that we don't have a capture problem similar to the European Union.
Okay, that's important. Increasingly, farmers are becoming more dependent on markets for nutrition. And also what we see is that most of those who are hungry are farmers who are tasked to produce the food today. While acknowledging markets are important and investing in them is even more so. But do you think that world should prioritize kitchen gardens, backyard poultry, and wet community markets to improve nutrition, make rural lives more resilient and less prone to market price fluctuations?
No, we cannot talk of one solution to the problem. Yeah. It's a combination of solutions. No, clearly we need the producers. We need the producers to be able to supply commodities and get the revenues that they need to get to be able to do that. Of course, having kitchen gardens or having school gardens or a small production of farmers for self-consumption, it could also help. It's part of the system. But at the end of the line, most of the people are moving to peri-urban areas and to rural areas, or what we call the hatchment areas. And we need to feed that people. So there is no way we can go away from that. So what is the problem? So the first problem I see, at least, is that farmers need to have better information so that they can better negotiate their prices. And that means shortening the transaction cost with intermediaries and so many middle lines to be able to go to the market. As long as the farmer is aware of the price they can sell, they could get a higher revenue. As long as he's aware of the standards he needs to comply so that his produce is accepted at a price premium because of the quality, no matter there is not a formal quality in the market, but the intermediaries know the quality and the wholesale market knows the quality, then he will get that premium. And that's what he is aiming to do. Digital technologies can help enormously to do that because it's an easy way to transfer that information. And the governments have to play a role to provide that type of information if the private sector cannot provide that type of information. So what we need to do is to bring more information to avoid that a few players in the value chain are able to extract the revenues because they have more information. Middlemen are okay, they are solving the problem in the market. But if you have asymmetries of information, that's the problem. And that's where digital technologies can play a role. So I will say we move in all the dimensions, but we need the agricultural system to operate better. And that's basically our goal. No?
So if we work to agriculture systems, what we see is that international trade in agriculture produce is increasing every year. And so that's a fact. But also what's a fact is that FAO has recently stated that if recent trends continue, the number of people affected by hunger will surpass 840 million by 2030, or 10% of the global population. And what the question that I ask is what farmers feel in food importing nations. They feel that WTO rules drive down farm gate prices below the true cost of growing food, compelling local farmers to grow unsustainably and into poverty. So the question is, do you think it's time to relook at WTO anti-dumping definitions, or to also maybe come up with something like nations are not allowed to export below the true cost of growing food, because selling or procuring at less than true cost of growing food also adds to biodiversity loss, and we need to stop this from happening. Do you think that's a possibility?
Okay, let's separate. I think that you referred to several topics, and let's separate them. No? So the first element that you mentioned was trade is increasing in agricultural commodities. And that's true. Even during the pandemic, the import bill remained basically the same, with the exception of meat and certain fish. And that was mostly because of the logistical problems. And that's a good thing. That means that more food is moving and more food is available. The worst we can do is to live in autarky, because then we won't be able to get the diversity of products that we need, especially to have access to healthy diets. The second element that you mentioned is that food that is moving borders, across borders. So there is a definition of what is a global value chain, for example, is when you move 3 borders, okay? Exporting one border is not a global value chain, it's basically you're exporting commodities. Now, but the second element is this movement of commodities across borders is not incorporating the cost of certain natural resources like water, energy, biodiversity, and so on and so forth, no? Or emissions even. And that's because those markets are not yet clear. These are not markets that have a price. So it's very difficult to measure that so that you can incorporate that in the food price that you transfer. And that's something that needs to be evolving. Like, for example, water is now traded in Chicago Exchange for California. Now, for California, it's feasible because it's an area that has drought, so the water is a very scarce commodity. So what Chicago Exchange is doing is basically creating a trading commodity so that to reduce the asymmetry of information between areas of surplus and areas of deficit so that you can and trade futures of water. Is that a solution? Not necessarily, depends on how well the market is structured. But we need to continue to evolve and to measure these externalities of trade-offs. So if I am going to export a mango from Peru to another country, that mango has to incorporate the water price, has to incorporate the soil characteristics, and so on and so forth, so that the consumer is paying what it costs, okay? And again, that not necessarily has to go to the producer, you're affecting a public good, no? So if it is about emissions, if I'm going to export meat from one location to the other, I am generating certain levels of emissions to produce that meat. And that externality to the environment, which is a public good, is not being priced, okay? Now, how we can resolve this and how we can start to create this market is basically to start creating this type of value for these externalities. For the case of emissions, what we would like to happen is that countries can trade emissions across borders. Meaning, if I have a New Zealand that can produce livestock at a very efficient way because they have the technology, instead of them reducing the production of meat, they will exchange those potential emissions, which are minimum in terms of efficiency of production, with a country like an African country, for example, where the technology is not there, and the same amount of animals being produced will create a huge cost of emissions. No? So we need to create those markets so that we can start pricing that, what we call is measuring the real cost of food. One of the efforts that we are doing in the Food System Summit is we are trying to model those externalities, and we are trying to assess, at least for a policymaker to understand what that means. No?
Very good. So that explains it. I just have two more questions, and one is again on the UN Food System Summit, game-changing propositions. Extensive evidence from modeling and experience suggests that taxes on unhealthy food or drink or similar drink products would bring positive dietary changes. Would you subscribe to some sort of a game-changing proposition which taxes unhealthy food or foods high in unsaturated fat, salt, and sugar?
So we have to be careful here, no? Because what we know today is that, first, we know that taxes are not the optimal instrument, no? We always will create a welfare loss to a society. But we have a bigger welfare loss, which is the non-communicable diseases that overweight and obesity is creating. And overweight and obesity is now growing a lot faster than undernourishment. So it's a big problem. It creates huge amounts of losses on health in the future. So in the present value, that's a huge cost to society. Now, what we know is that taxes in sugars, for example, in commodities in sugars, and there is evidence in Mexico, in California, in Barbados, those type of taxes have an impact, okay? And they could have an impact because these are commodities that have enormous amount of sugar that or saturated fats that are elastic to the price. So if the price increases because of the tax, the consumption will increase. But it depends also on the reality and the country, okay? And it also depends on the reactions of the companies who produce these goods. There are companies to increase dependency that could increase intensity of sugar, no matter the tax, and therefore that will increase consumption. But in average, what we are observing in the systematic evidence is that taxes in sugars could create a positive effect in terms of reduction of consumption. But what we also know is that subsidies to commodities which are more healthy could also increase the consumption of those commodities. So the issue here is how we optimize the policies, no? And how we bring a package of policies or strategies to reduce sugar consumption, but at the same time improve the dietary quality consumption, and how we can combine both of them so that we can take the returns. And it goes further than just taxes as one instrument of subsidies. We know, for example, experience in Chile with the new labeling mechanisms that they put in place. they have evaluated the impacts and they show a positive impact of labeling and providing information to consumers. So our view is that it's not only one policy instrument, it's a package of policy instruments that could help, which goes from financial instruments like taxes and subsidies to information to change consumer behavior of what they are eating so that they can make better choices.
I think this is exactly what the proposition is. And you are right, we need a package of practices, we need carrots, we need sticks, and we need other influences or to change diets. My last question is it ethical and moral for individual donors or philanthropists to influence national policies, more specifically on food? This is a question that more and more civil society is asking about large philanthropies or donations influencing policies. Do you think they should be encouraged or frowned upon? What is your personal opinion
No,
on this?
I think, private sector, private agents or philanthropies or can make things, and there is no way you can control them. No, the important thing is that countries and policymakers have sufficient evidence, science-based evidence, so that they can make the proper choices, no matter what these other sectors will act. So a company can tell you as a government, look, my product is the most efficient and is the one that will create the less emissions. Now, our job as agencies working in the sector is to create public good information so that this policymaker knows that that type of a commodity, for example, won't do what is being said. The same is to show them that if a philanthropic wants to influence in a specific technology, you want to bring to that government all the science that you know so that they can make the proper decision no matter who is pushing for it. And that's what we need to do. And it applies across the board. No, it goes from food to other things. Why food is more sensitive? Because food is a human right. Okay, and therefore, if we are trying to affect a human right, then the ethical dimension is extremely high. No, this is exactly the same reason as putting food into the futures market, no, into the Chicago Exchange, for example. 2007, 2008, if you recall, one of the reasons why the prices of food start to exacerbate, despite of the shocks that create the first spike, but the exacerbation happened because of excessive trading in the futures market, what we call speculation. And it was because there was excessive volatility. Now, in a normal market of minerals, that doesn't matter. Basically, you can do it, and you have some regulatory caps in the exchange. But in the case of food, that shouldn't be the case because it's a human right. Okay, and we cannot afford as human beings that the price of food is exacerbated to make the profits of a few people. So that's why it makes sense for that type of commodities that are human rights to put additional regulatory measures. And whenever there is excessive volatility, and we have to define what excessive means, you can cap and stop the trading of those commodities because it's affecting human beings. So that's the difference between gold and a piece of bread and food. And that's what we need to have very clear.
So that's a very interesting answer. And thank you, Maximo, for your honesty and vividly answering the question. We really appreciate it. And for those listening in, thank you. Until next Thursday, a goodbye to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maximo. Thank you so much.